We're live. Welcome to episode 5 of the Supper Heroes podcast. And today we have Anna Trapido or Trapido. I don't know which Trapido, food anthropologist, chef, and PhD. Welcome to the show, Anna.
Hi.
Now, I've been dying to ask how a chef gets a PhD, or was it how a PhD became a chef?
Yeah, it's sort of that way. I think, essentially a chronic inability to focus. That my first degree is in anthropology, and I have a whole kind of other life as a person who knows about occupational lung disease in the Eastern Cape. So I know why gold miners get sick, and mostly I know how to get them compensated. So
Wow.
yeah, I'm an epidemiologist, the PhD, and for a long time, and then I went to chef school, and for a long time I just thought those things don't connect. And I remember once I was icing gingerbread men in the middle of the night, and for a company that were paying me almost nothing, and I thought nobody cares, and I've got a PhD, and I realized that of course nobody cares, because when you choose to ice gingerbread men, it's not relevant. But increasingly, the fact that I do know about working in the Eastern Cape, and that I know stupid things like which side of the kraal women are allowed to sit on, and it has made a circle, because increasingly what I do is sort of food anthropology. So I use the food stuff and the social stuff. And yeah, it increasingly helps that I do know about rural communities and how to not cause offense, I suppose. People are more willing to tell you about their lunch if they're not pissed off by you.
Cool. So I mean, I think I could ask you about that and talk for hours. But the thing that struck me was a few years ago, we actually met at an event where you were promoting this book, EAT-TING.
Right.
And it was off the back of me, not in any way related, but I was out promoting Real Meal Revolution and obviously looking at ways to encourage people to eat healthier food. And one of the questions I've always had on my mind is how do we get people to eat more real food, but in a financially viable way and, in a cost-effective way. And I saw this book come along, and it just like blew my mind, because it was using like local foods. And what I didn't realize is how much food had actually changed in South Africa over the time. And could you just tell us a little bit about pre-colonization South African cuisine?
Right. I mean, I think that when one looks at South African food, you don't want to sort of just endlessly be that person that drones on about colonialism and apartheid, but actually you can't discuss food without discussing land. And land in a South African context is so complicated, and there's such a story of dispossession that results in poverty, and that it very substantially changes the obviously people's economic status, but also their ability to access certain ingredients. So if you look at if you want to know about the South African diet, whatever that means, and food is so, it's a constantly moving target, and it should be. All food all over the world is. But if you look at pre-colonial or early colonial accounts of what indigenous South Africans were eating, there are all sorts of missionaries, for instance, who talk about food in KwaZulu-Natal, and they describe, 15 different kinds of sorghum that you use each one for a different thing. So some of them are for beer, some of them are for more solid foods, because again, that distinction between, what is a food and what is a drink is quite a sort of Eurocentric one, that in Southern African culture, these things exist on much more of a continuum. So what is a thin porridge and what is a beer is a much more so that beers are thought of as food. There isn't a separate category, and beers are thought of as nutritious, as, indeed they are. It's just fermented sorghum most of the time, so it's
Right.
enormously good for you. So there's a wide range of all sorts of both indigenous ancient grains, so sorghum, millet, those sorts of things. And so within that, there are 5 different kinds of millet and 5 different kinds of sorghum, etc. And then there's a very wide range of things that, again, in English tend to get classified, they get described as spinach. Boom.
Yes.
And, they are actually 50 different kinds of wild leafy greens, each of which you use in a slightly different way. So, for instance, there are certain wild leafy greens that are quite peppery. So you wouldn't ever use them entirely on their own. So you would use, 2/3 the sort of milder Huabe is, for instance, an example of that. And then you would use 1/3 of the more kind of intense peppery thing, so that you're creating flavor with those. And then, it depends where you are in South Africa, because food is so terroir specific. So what's true for Limpopo is not true for KwaZulu-Natal, for instance. That Natal is just such, it's cattle country. It's if God created a place that was perfect for cattle, he kind of would have thought of Natal. So in that context, there's lots of dairy and lots of fermented dairy, and so that kind of soured milk, which again exists in a range of gradations. If Eskimos have lots of words for snow, Southern Africans have lots of different words for, how much curd to how much whey. And at the one end, what you've got is, drained curds, so amasi that's then been drained, so the whey is gone. And those curds are essentially South Africa's fresh cheese. They're ricotta. That once you go into places like Limpopo, and especially the further north you go, these things are so subjective, but certainly for me, they're really just kind of drop dead fantastic the way you get to certain parts of Italy and you think, God, these people can cook. The really drop dead fantastic food is in Venda. Where there are lots of nuts. So marula nuts, for instance, you've got the marula fruit, and then inside the fruit is a hard pip, and if you hit that in a very skilled way, it will open up, and inside are marula nuts, which they taste like pine nuts, they taste like themselves, but to the extent that they taste like something else, they are rich and creamy and generous. And so suddenly, essentially what people make in Venda is almost a bit like pesto, that everything has got a kind of rich nut base, whether that be ground nuts or more recently peanuts or these marula nuts. So that you've got this kind of creamy mouthfeel that just sort of says, I love you, that's a really rich, generous sort of creaminess. So, yeah, I think that in general, there are, this is a country with vast biodiversity, so the food is very regionally specific. But what it isn't is the way that modern urban Black South African food is often sort of stereotyped as being very monocrop. And so it's very maize heavy, it's perceived as being very oil heavy, and that the vegetables used are quite limited, so spinach, potatoes, tomatoes. And actually, I don't think that that's necessarily true. If you look at people's shopping, if you're at Checkers and you watch quite poor people shopping going through, and you think, well, actually, there's such a sort of middle class conspiracy that says that like poor people eat badly. And, here I am with all this kind of processed shit in my trolley. And here's this person who's got spinach and tomatoes and onions and a bit of fish and, some offal. And who am I to be assuming that because I've read the fancy food magazine that I am eating better? That a lot of the time that's not true at all. But you know, undoubtedly, what happens with apartheid is people are driven off land, and the less access you have to land, the less access you have to deciding what gets grown, apart from anything else. So suddenly, the crops that suit, you know, industrial farming, rather than things that people have a preference for that's about culture or, you know, personal preferences or whatever. So it kind of, in the way that, you know, modernization and industrialization everywhere sort of damages the individuality of particular cultural experiences. This is like a very extreme version of that.
Right.
You know, it is a kind of transition into modernity. It's just a very traumatic one.
Yeah. And I mean, that's fascinating. I had no idea that we had like, you know, region specific cuisine. And I mean, it would make perfect sense, but it's, you know, no one knows that. Well, very few people actually know that.
You and me. It is so delicious. It's like kind of hitting Tuscany. You just think, God, you know, this is a region of people in which people can seriously cook. Even people who cook badly cook well. You know, that way that like Ethiopian food, for instance, you think there's no such thing as bad Ethiopian food. There's some Ethiopian food is better than others.
Yes.
You know, that the kind of core flavor components are so good and so generous that it almost feels a bit, in that same way that certain sorts of Congolese food feels, it's almost a bit obscene, you know, that it feels a bit sort of overly sexy. You know, you think that there are messages here that are about love and passion and sex, and there's a kind of opulence that even people who are very poor can generate, because there's this kind of nut base essentially, which makes for such a kind of rich fatty base.
Wow.
So yeah,
And so
we must go to Venda
yeah,
on
Venda.
holiday.
No, it's on the list officially as of today.
It's fantastic. You would not believe how delicious Venda is.
That's awesome. So, you know, so if I understand what you're saying, as sort of as sort of cultures were marginalized, the Western diet sort of took over. And you were referring to corn and wheat in particular, just industrialized crops, and so that's now made, because you mentioned in the book, and I don't know whether it was you or Paul talking about it, but you were speaking about how now that it's become in African culture almost seen as poor to be eating the real traditional foods. So saying eating foods like sorghum and millet are perhaps seen as less fancy than eating white foods. And I mean white, like literally white colored grains. Yeah.
Overly processed.
Yeah.
Yeah. And look, I mean, again, that's a phenomenon that you get all over the world, is that people, you know, that modernity comes with a whole lot of, you know, part of it is, you know, kind of media. It's very easy to blame media, but, you know, part of it's that, you know, it's just pushed everywhere. Part of it's, you know, that there are, I mean, for instance, in terms of maize, it's very clear that, you know, the way maize arrives in Southern Africa is, you know, I mean, it's like the fact that we love it is like a form of culinary Stockholm syndrome, you know, that it arrives with the slave trade. So, you know, all maize comes from the Americas, that it arrives, you know, along the east coast of Southern Africa with Portuguese slave traders, that, you know, initially there's quite a lot of hostility to maize and suspicion, because it's very water intensive relative to just, if you can hear that noise, we have a puppy in our house who's making a terrible noise, but she'll stop. That's there, you see, she's okay. So maize arrives in Southern Africa, that it's much more water intensive, and we've always been a water scarce region. You know, that's not a recent phenomenon. It might be getting worse, but we've never been kind of plentiful in matters water. That, you know, that as it gets in, the reason that it becomes successful is that maize grows quite quickly. And, you know, as Shaka's armies begin to move through Southern Africa, you need a crop that and maize you can harvest in various stages. You know, you can eat it green as a mealie cob, or you can have it as grain later on. And so you need a crop that you can grab from the fields and run into the mountains with. So, except that part of the reason that Shaka's armies are moving out into other people's territories is to do with the fact that the maize itself is so water intensive that you need more land than you needed before. So it's a vicious circle. But so all over, you see the way that in the Free State and in Mpumalanga and those sorts of regions, you see maize following the kind of Mfikane Zulu army infiltration into other parts of the country. That, then, but initially, maize is a whole range of different heritage mazes, and you can see exactly which slave ships came and from which parts of the Americas they came by tracing the genetics of the maize. So those heritage mazes that you see that are kind of multicolored and so pretty, that they get replaced in the 1920s because the demands of the mining industry are such that they want a very standardized food in the hostels. So they put a lot of money into developing a single kind of very productive, very white maize, which people then, mine workers then come home, so they're on these short-term contracts and they go home between them, bringing these new tastes with them. And, if you've had a terrible time on the mines, you don't want to tell your family that when you get home. You want to tell them that actually you're okay and you've brought money and you've brought prestige and all of these things. So there's this kind of sense that this maize that I'm bringing back from the mines is
a gift,
superior to any of these heritage mazes that people are already growing. So which are much more nutritious and so. There are waves of sort of maize damage that happen in Southern Africa, but gradually what they do is they replace almost entirely, and more in some areas than others, but they replace the indigenous sorghums and millets, which in some ways, millet especially requires an awful lot of bird scaring for one thing, because birds think millet is fabulous. That's why, at the moment, that practically the only place you can buy the indigenous millet is if you go to the pet food aisle and you go for what's marked as canary food. There, in those bags, is the indigenous millet. But I buy it and cook with it all the time. But you have to be buying canary food. Sometimes it's labeled budgie food as well. Go to the pet food aisle and you will find the indigenous millet. If you go to the health food shops, you will find at vast expense imported millets. That all the carbon mile issues and just don't taste as nice as far as I'm concerned. But so those gradually get replaced. But those grains, so what cereals, are, they are low GI, they are gluten-free, they are all of these fantastic things. One of the things that makes me really sad is that sorghum, which is really so delicious, it's the great grain of Southern Africa. You can do everything with it. You can bake with it, you can brew with it, you can make sort of risotto-like things, you can make porridges, you can ferment with it, etc. That sorghum is not on our VAT exempted list, but mealie meal is. And that just seems to me like an absolute crime against heritage, that if you're wanting to encourage people to eat things that are both good for them in terms of their nutritional status, but also just in terms of their kind of heritage and cultural experience, and just in terms of their palate, because God knows sorghum tastes so much better. If you are wanting to encourage people to do that, make it cheap enough for them to do so. The fact that it's low GI and it will keep you full for longer is not the way you're making those decisions in the supermarket if you're poor. That you're making the decision on the immediate price implications of this bag of 5 kgs versus that bag. So it just seems, you don't even have to take maize meal off that list. If you would just put sorghum on the VAT exempted list, that would make such a difference to the way people could engage with it.
Yeah, the sorghum has been sort of on my mind for a while, and I read some article, I won't name the food giant, but they obviously got pressure from someone to do research. And they said, yes, we've put the total of 500,000 Rand into testing the viability of sorghum. And you're like, for like a multi-billion Rand company, 500,000 Rand is like a cheek. That's actually just rude. So now what impact do you think this has had on health over however many years?
Viability, just before we move off viability.
Yeah, sure.
In a water scarce environment, something that is so much more drought resistant, that you have to look at the knock-on consequences. You can't just look at, while we irrigate our mealie meal so extensively, well, it's cheaper to make mealie meal. Well, is it really cheaper, and what are the long-term social consequences of that, and or the short-term nutritional consequences? Are those costs ending up in the public health system? It's all very well if big industry is making more money, we're more viable because we sell mealie meal. But the rest of us, our tax money is paying for the consequences of all the diabetes and high blood pressure and all of that. So I think that those sums can be done in multiple ways.
Yeah, well, and that's what I liked so much about EAT-TING, was that it's this. I mean, it seems as though if everything existed here before sort of mass scale agriculture, that it grows more naturally, or it's probably more viable to grow it if it was grown without an industry backing it. It seems to be healthier, and for some reason, it's just sort of fallen off the map. But what EAT-TING did was combine. It made it look delicious and stylish, and sort of. It's obviously beautifully written, and it made health sense and financial sense. Now, just to put the disclaimer in, I know like a lot of people who watch this know me from the low carb space, and I know that not everyone's married to the low carb ideology. But what you did say was that the white grains or highly processed grains had an impact on the health. So what is your stance on low GI, high fiber grains versus the white foods? Like, how strongly do you think that impacted the diabetes epidemic versus, fat and sugar?
Oh, I think it's almost entirely responsible for it. Yeah, I mean, look, I start as an anthropologist and then I'm a chef. My co-author in Po Chukuru is a dietitian, so she comes from a more medical perspective. But in terms of, so my interests are always primarily, does it taste good? Is it filling a social role that is adding to the kind of beauty and complexity of being a human? And then I look at health. So, and I know that's probably not very kind of good for the universe, but that's sort of just the way my brain works. But I think that, that in the process of destroying Southern African food culture and making things taste much less good, we have also very dramatically impacted on health. That if you think of something as simple, for instance, as samp and beans, if you have that in the Eastern Cape, in rural Transkei, that what people will do is they will either, they've got cattle, so either there will be a great lump of butter, or there will be a great lump of, schmaltz, essentially, chicken fat, that's put in at the end and mixed in, and that is delicious. If you are in a township and what people do is put a great lump of rama in the top, suddenly it's not nice at all in terms of, the way, these are all subjective things, but, that it seems to me that a lot of what you're saying about health, works just as well as this is good for culture and it's good for taste. And all of those are moving targets. All of them are completely subjective. And the interesting thing about taste buds is that they tend to like what they know. So that, for instance, all little children initially that I've ever seen reject the McDonald's and play with the toy. They don't actually like the taste of the burger. That you're left as the mummy thinking, oh, I'll eat it because it's here and favorite. All they really want is the toy. But if you go on doing that, by the time they are 3 or 4, they will reject other food in favor of McDonald's because that's what their mouths know. That we all, the concept of an acquired taste, almost everything's an acquired taste. So, as a parent, one of the things you can do is teach your children to like the taste of knickknacks and Rama, or you can teach them to like the taste of fermented sorghum. That those are about the ways in which your child experiences food. So yeah, that I think that on the whole, what's good for taste and what's good for culture, and what's good for the economy in a broader sense rather than what's good for a particular multinational tends to be what's good for people's physiology as well.
I have to say I strongly agree. So let's talk about eating for a bit. So I mean, it sounds weird that because I wanted to interview you or do something like, I think it was like 3 years ago at the Kingsmead Book Fair, and then never got it together. But I think this is like and I think you did win an award or two, but this is like the unsung hero of the cookbook industry.
It's sweet of you.
It really, I promise you, if you look back on my Instagram post, and I hardly ever post, I took a photo of this book and I was like, this is the next big thing. I was like, this is going to change It's amazing.
I mean, essentially, we like it. We're glad we wrote it anyway. We learned lots, and we met lots of kind of fantastic, interesting people and tasted lots of delicious food. That they can't do it into a second edition because nobody wants to buy it.
Go and buy it now. Buy it.
Well, that's very sweet of you because I think it's a lovely book and I think that it raises interesting debates. I think that we might do certain things differently if we did it again, and we'd have a clearer idea about who we were talking to. That we thought we were talking to upper middle class Black women,
Right.
and that actually what's been interesting is how many white male vegans have liked it, for instance, and and how many in general, quite a lot of African men have also been much more enthusiastic than their wives. And I think partly, women will often say that food takes long, and you want that food, you cook it yourself. I'm an accountant in an Audi. I'm not cooking that food. You want that, you do it yourself. And so you have these earnest conversations with sort of young Black men who are trying to entice their wives into being interested in a book, and that their wives would much rather be looking at books on Tuscany. So I think that that what we were trying to do is say that this food doesn't have to take long, that you don't have to be that young women that kind of way that from the outside, the way that Makotis are treated as sort of unpaid domestic labor, and that the assumption is they have endless time on their hands to be stirring pots and collecting firewood and water and all of those things, that there is a perception amongst quite a lot of kind of young bourgeois African women that this is the food of oppression in a way, that it's the food of kind of gender discrimination and youth discrimination. But what we were trying to say was get a pressure cooker, recognize that you are a person who has a domestic worker in your house anyway, who has all these skills, who is at home all day anyway. That there are a range of ways of doing this and still being the girl with the Audi and the kind of smart job. So yeah, but I think that we need to recognize that all the things that people rush after because they think that they're fashionable, that they've read in smart magazines, that they all exist within Southern African traditional food culture. So, the idea that, organic is a new thing, or that, this idea that somehow, foraging was invented by, white male chefs in Cape Town. It's like, well, nothing to it. It's like, congratulations, you kind of worked out how to look for a mushroom. Well, every herd boy in the Transkei does that. The notions of low GI, ancient grains, fermenting. The Southern Africa is one of the great fermenting cultures of the world.
I didn't even know that. I had no idea.
Yeah,
I mean, it makes sense because sorghum beer and damas and all that, but you don't think that we actually have a place in the global.
Africans ferment everything. And at a whole range of different grades, and they have a whole series of, this is for this sort of person, this is for that sort of person, this you can have after you've had a baby, this one is for young men coming out of initiation, that the kind of subtleties within the ways in which people relate to fermentation are so beautiful and complex and full of kind of symbolism and taste great. And you only have to look at, even things like prisoners on Robben Island who were endlessly attempting to create ferment secretly under their beds, and that Walter Sisulu was always keeping some of his porridge aside and trying to make it ferment under the bed and getting caught and sent into solitary confinement. Fermenting is so central to people's sense of who they are, that it's like, I ferment, therefore I am, in terms of Southern African indigenous traditional culture. That if you had to close your eyes and be blindfolded and be given a spoonful of food and say, what do you taste? The way you taste Southern Africa, I think, is in that kind of soured taste. That we are so full of kind of fashionable, glamorous things that we imagine. That the amount of money that is spent on quinoa. My supermarket has 3 colors of quinoa in 2 different sections of the supermarket. It's in the health section and it's in the grain section. The only place I can buy the indigenous millet is in the budgie food section. What's that about? They have so many of the same qualities without the carbon mile factor.
Absolutely.
So it is about learning to love yourself. And in a way, if you look at Australian cuisine, the point at which that really kind of flourishes is where they suddenly, Australian chefs start engaging with where they are in the world and the terroir, and they start liking themselves. And obviously, Australia's got all sorts of complicated issues around race and land and dispossession, and that's not that's a whole other struggle. But there is a sense that once you think, hey, we're great, and Australians do nothing but tell you how fabulous they are, and good for them, once you start believing that, then you can start being creative with your own core flavors. Until then, you're just copying, that you're a minor bird, and minor birds can be enormously clever, but it is just a form of mimicry, isn't it? They don't understand what they're saying, the minor birds.
No. It's interesting you say that, because there's, I remember some people moaning about the top chefs being, the top 10 chefs in South Africa often being, more foreigners, having more foreigners in the top 10 than not. But I don't want to go into that.
I've got a theory, and I want to try my theory out on you because I think it'll make you laugh apart from anything else, which is that if you want to bring really good foreign trained chefs to South Africa, what you do is you send Afrikaans girls to chef school, because they finish chef school in Stellenbosch and they go to London, where they meet a Frenchman, and Afrikaans girls come home. You send an English-speaking girl to London, she never comes home. She's no use in this exchange. But if you send Afrikaans girls, they don't live without their mothers. So they come home and they bring the Frenchman with you. And if you look at all of those people, Luc Del Roberts, Frank Dangereux, all of them, when you start picking up their bread, what they have is they have an Afrikaans wife.
That's mind-blowing.
You want to bring kind of world-class international chefs to South Africa, you send Afrikaans girls to London. You know, with a chef qualification. They then probably never use again, but they are a great recruiter.
That's a
So
fantastic idea.
theory.
And so, I want to talk about brand South Africa for a bit. I read an incredibly long article that you wrote on, I think it was in 2017 or 18, but it was brilliant. And you wrote about how how France and even England, to an extent, have strengthened their food, their food brand with, I think it's called geographic indication. On a lot of
denomination. It's like
denomination,
it's what the French do.
And South Africa only has 3 products under, what did you say? I keep saying indication, but you said it's
called geographical denomination.
Denomination,
They describe that in the kind of EU regulations. And it simply means you can't call champagne unless it comes from Champagne.
Right.
That it's about saying regional foods need to be protected, so that, that Karoo lamb, for instance, is a classic example. We all know what that means, that it conjures up something much bigger than the kind of chemical components in a bit of lamb. But there's brand value in that people will preferentially pick it. So if you are allowed to just call anything Karoo lamb, and the classic one, I think, in Southern Africa is piri piri, which is the birthright of the people of Mozambique, and yet is just, that phrase is not only misspelt all over the world, so we spell it with an E rather than an I, but that it's getting less and less clear in people's minds that is the creation of this astonishing fusion culture in Mozambique. And that the amount of money that could be generated for Mozambique in all sorts of ways, in tourism, if you think about the way that Peru kind of just changed. Lima used to be that place people only went to if they wanted to get kidnapped, and now you go there because they've got all these top restaurants in the top 100, if you could really market Mozambique to the world as the birthplace of piri piri, the tourism opportunities in that, and then just saying, actually, guys, you can't call it piri piri unless it is. There's the number of weird things that get classified as that it's just insulting. That the French won't let you do it to their great things. So why would Southern Africans, put up with that?
And most people think that piri piri is Portuguese. I mean, I know Mozambique's Portuguese, but like, if you learned of piri piri through Nando's, Nando's doesn't say we're Mozambican chicken. They say they're Portuguese.
They have gotten better.
Okay.
They used to do that Taste of Portugal thing, and they are beginning to quite substantially engage with their African heritage. And I mean, I think that and piri piri is a whole other conversation, but that Africans have been making hot sauces long before there were chilies in Africa. That chilies are, again, they come with slave ships from the Americas, and different chilies come to different parts of Africa in various different ways, but very quickly, chilies will crossbreed very easily. So you get these landrace chilies that are entirely African in origin, that they don't exist anywhere else in the world. And again, it's about terroir, it's about the soil and the sun and the way the water works and all of that. So, so you have these very unique tastes that long before there were chilies, there were hot sauces, because there are other ways of making that burny thing in your mouth. And if you read, for instance, 14th century Arab accounts, traveler accounts, and earlier even, they talk about all these hot sauces all the way down, Somalia, and that Mozambique is a great trade kind of center from very early on. So from about the 11th century, that's an international center from the spice trade. That it's a way that Europeans access, because Arabs won't tell where they're getting quite a lot of the spice. They say no, they come from paradise, or they come from this there's a giant bird that brings down the cinnamon, and they've got all these stories to keep people from getting at them. So you have to buy them from them. But the ports in Mozambique are there, and that Swahili coastline in general is very international from very early on, and a range of, for instance, grains of paradise, which is an indigenous African spice. You find it's in the records at the Vatican in the 14th century being purchased. That Africa is much more international than the last 500 years would have one believe. So yeah, geographical denominations, essentially it's about protecting culinary birthrights, and other countries have done that very successfully. And I think that Southern Africa should be analyzing that, not because we're somehow nice people. There are very direct knock-on economic consequences, and other people are making money off the back of these kind of great kind of flavor repertoires.
Absolutely. I mean, I was thinking about, Argentina boomed in I think it was the 20s or 30s when refrigeration became, more accessible, because they have amazing beef. And Argentinian beef to this day is still a brand, even though I'm not sure it's...
Exactly.
I was thinking, like, if you were saying Natal, you could get like Zulu beef or something, and that could be an insane brand that's truly South African. But are there any products? So we've got I read you said we have Argon Oil, rooibos, and then Karoo lamb, and that's it.
Argan Oil is North African, and the Argon Oil industry is interesting in that they were the first group of people to get they've actually got an appellation contrôlée, so they are registered within the French system prior to the EU system. And Argan Oil is interesting because it's a nut, almost like a marula nut. And I think a marula nut is one of the kind of classic, that's a very obvious, Northern Limpopo territory specific ingredient. But Argan Oil has to pass traditionally through they now do it with a machine and chemicals, but has to pass through the belly of a goat. So the thing is that only the very poorest people, and specifically the very poorest women in Issuria, which is the region where you get Argan Oil from, were prepared to work with Argan Oil, because you have to work with goat poo. So in fact, the women's cooperatives in Issuria have been enormously socially kind of uplifting, because these are groups of women who produce this beautiful, delicious ingredient that is highly sought after in sort of international fine dining situations, who were the poorest of the poor, who have, mobilized to get themselves an appellation contrôlée, so you cannot make Argan Oil anywhere but in Issuria. You have to call it something else. If you can grow argan nuts in other places, but so they now have the monopoly on real Argan Oil.
And that's not coming through the goat. Hey, that's
well, some of it still comes through the goat, and purists will tell you that the best stuff comes through the goat. But essentially what the goat is, it's the goat's digestive system. So if you can find some other way of getting into the nut,
right.
And like in Venda, they just hit the marula nut in a very skilled way. That I had to go, and I was rubbish, because you crush the nut if you're not careful, so opening them up. But yeah, so in South Africa, the two that are, that rooibos and Karoo lamb are the ones that have an official denomination already, which means you cannot grow rooibos in California and call it rooibos. You have to call it something else. That there are, other great Southern African products that could be kind of mobilized in that way. And I think that there's both kind of pride, and there's direct economic consequences. And often there's direct economic consequences for rural communities, and often for older women in rural communities who still have the skills to process those things. That, for instance, in Venda, the marula nut thing is now, there's all sorts of people who want to buy marula nuts at smart hipster markets in Joburg and that kind of thing. So those ladies are now earning decent amounts of money from processing the marula nuts. And what they say, those older women, is that now that there is money involved, then, obviously nobody wants to be involved with something that's like got no prestige and no financial benefits attached to it. But younger people in those communities are now interested in a way that before they were quite dismissive.
Right.
So, you can uplift the most vulnerable because they are often the people that have the traditional skills.
Totally.
So it's terrific on all sorts of levels.
Yeah, I mean, so quick one, but so sorghum, by the sounds of things, if it does come from Southern Africa, it could fit into that category. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean that sorghum is found across broader Southern Africa, as is millet. So you couldn't pin it down in the way that you can pin down cheddar cheese, for instance.
Right.
Cheddar is a very specific district, but you could absolutely, there are varieties that are specific to certain areas. So there are heritage varieties, and you could certainly pin those down. And there are processed products as well that you could, say that like piri-piri, for instance, that's none of those ingredients are specifically indigenous to the region, but the human ingenuity that created this beautiful combination that happened in Africa. And I mean, you were talking about the way that South Africans especially say, "Oh, I love Portuguese food." And when you ask them what they love, they say they like peri-peri chicken. And you think, well, that in Mozambique, in Portugal, people would understand that as food of the diaspora. That they understand that it's part of the Portuguese kind of colonial experience, but that it's not Portuguese food. South Africans go to Portugal, always come back desperately disappointed.
Like I didn't get my peri-peri chicken.
Yeah. But that in Mozambique, for instance, politely, peri-peri chicken is referred to as frango africana, and actually on the street it's referred to as frango cathriel, which is a very pejorative word for Africans. But that the understanding in everybody's head is that is an African creation. That it's a fusion of when you've got Africans and Arabs and Portuguese people in one space. There's a melding that happens there, and that creates these entirely new tastes, and that's what piri-piri is, for instance.
So
that is frango africana.
Frango africana, and that's a goodie. We should.
That's the nicest. The ruder version is what people actually call it. And the chili, if you want to get even ruder, is look at what piri-piri sakana actually means, because you can't make piri-piri with just any chili. Again, that's a thing that all the way people they say it's piri-piri. It's not piri-piri unless it's made with a specific chili. Which only has a rude name.
Okay.
You can look it up.
So, looking to the future, and this is the last question, by the way. I didn't actually realize when I asked you to join me that we would be doing this on a public holiday. So I appreciate you joining me.
I just wish I'd sort of I was faffing around making muffins, and
that's all good.
Focused.
But, no, it's really, don't worry about it. So where do you see, what is your wish for food in South Africa? How would you like to see a change over the next 10, 15 years?
Well, look, in the first instance, I think we just have to acknowledge that, even before COVID-19, we were in a an economic crisis that's caused serious hunger, and an ecological crisis that's resulting in other sorts of deprivation that will cause hunger. So partly, I think we need to engage with how are we going to ensure that people are fed in a way that feeds every part of them, that we can't have children going to school hungry, that we can't have teenagers with high blood pressure because they just are eating too many sparkles. And that's a feature of township boys, because girls at least want to be thin, so they eat slightly better. But township boys, the rates of kind of soaring blood pressure, to the extent that they're actually like in kidney failure, is terrifyingly high in teenage boys. We're not talking old men.
Wow.
So those kinds of issues, we need to deal with that. And I don't see why beautiful tastes and like really exciting creativity have to be separated from that. That if you say that engaging with hunger means you have to eat boring food and it has to be grey and it has to be virtuous, but it can't taste delicious, then you're missing the point that humanity is about saying food is a delicious, creative thing. And that is the one thing that all humans do. They learn how to make a fire very early on, and they use that to do all these beautiful things. So I think that we want to make better connections between food politics and food creativity, such that we've got chefs who are able to make links with rural communities about indigenous ingredients. And those things are all completely possible, and it makes for better food at every level. That it will make for better food in smart restaurants on the top 10 lists, if people are really engaging with what are the fantastic flavors that exist in this space. But that also makes for better economics on a broader level, and it's more inclusive. And so, yeah, that would be my hope. And who knows, that in a crisis, quite often what happens is that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. So then then you get a whole other thing happening. But yeah, that fantasy hope is that we somehow create linkages that allow for everybody to thrive and for everything to be more delicious.
Well, I hope that comes true. And on that note, I'll let you go to enjoy the rest of your day off. This is Youth Day for anyone watching in the future. And yeah, thank you so much for joining me. That was mind blowing. Pretty much everything you said blew my mind. And Anna, look, I've been promoting your book, which I think you may have even forgotten about. But for those of you who want to read it, it's EAT-TING. But what else? Where else can people get you to follow you? Read more of your stuff.
I have an Instagram account that is actually, I see you've got @Trapido Anna, which is actually not me. That's a strange Lithuanian cousin. But I am something called @Trapido Territory.
Trapido Territory. So I actually had you wrong the whole time. So Trapido Territory, like...
Yes, is I think a cousin in Lithuania. Who's also called Anna Trapido, but it's not her.
All right, so no one follow that one.
And I'm not very sort of internet savvy, but I do that, and then I just sort of I've got a column in the Daily Maverick. I do a lot of stuff for City Press. That and Poe and I are sort of pottering around with things. It's we will.
Well, I'm just going to say I'm just going to call it Watch This Space. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Awesome. Well, thanks so much. And to those of you watching, please like and share. Let every South African hear this because it's important. Have a rad day, everyone. Bye.
Cool. Bye.